Okay, so hi everyone. We'll start where we stopped last time, which is with the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And here is the okay. So just a little review where we were. Okay. So we want to do a key agreement, right? For all the beautiful symmetric cryptos that we learned. And there's two parties, attacker in between, who is passive. So the attacker hears everything, but does not interfere for now. And the Merkle puzzles is not satisfactory, really. Here is a new type of protocol with a new type of assumptions that are essentially equivalent to just secure key exchange, what you need in this protocol, but are reasonable assumptions, and they have allowed all sorts of things to happen in cryptography. So, okay, hold on a second. Okay, so G is the generator of a multiplicative group mod P. It's a cyclic group. So if P is a prime, so there exist integers in the set, such that if you look at their consecutive powers, mod P, G squared, G cubed, G to the fourth, etc., they are going to fill up this set. Okay, and when you exponentiate G to the P minus 1, then you actually hit a 1. So it's like exponentiating G to the P minus 1 mod P. It's the same as exponentiating G to the 0. And if you exponentiate further, then you just cycle. Okay. So in that setting, if you Alice is going to take a little exponent A and send G to the A. So this is a random group element in this group. Bob is going to do the same with his little exponent B. And as we saw last time, both parties can compute this key. So G to the exponent, which is a product of the little a Alice chose and a little b that Bob chose. Both of them can compute it. Alice can compute this way, but exponentiating Bob's contribution to her exponent. And Bob can compute this way, exponentiating Alice's contribution, group element, to his exponent. And they, by homomorphism of exponentiation, so exponentiation is sequential in that if you exponentiate to a bunch of integers over and over, right, what it translates into exponentiating by a product of these two integers, and that is what is used here. Okay, now we said last time that this is we're going to define this as a Diffie-Hellman function. It's a function that takes group elements, capital A and capital B, and computes the Diffie-Hellman key corresponding to this key exchange. Now, that function can be computed efficiently if you know the trapdoor, which is either discrete logarithm between G and this element, which is a little a, or the discrete logarithm mod P of between base G and this element, which is the little b. So if you can compute either Alice's or Bob's exponents, then you can compute this value using either Alice's or Bob's algorithm, right? Just like on the previous slide, Alice and Bob can both compute. But extracting the little a and the little b from these inputs is clearly, that's a discrete logarithm problem, right? So that is, it's a discrete logarithm assumption that's hard. And as we talked last time, this is not, we don't know equivalence in general between computing discrete logs and computing Diffie-Hellman function. On the other hand, we also don't know of any other ways to compute the Diffie-Hellman function faster than solving the discrete logarithm problem in that group and using these trapdoors to compute this. Okay, so this function is believed as hard as the discrete logarithm, and so we have this general number field sieve algorithm, the best known for computing discrete logs in modular residues, right? So a computer discrete logarithm of some base g with some base g of a group element, any other residue mod p, and the discrete logarithm is mod p. And that has an exponential algorithm, but it's exponential to the power that is not linear in the length of the prime, the modulus, but it's linear in the third root. So that's why these numbers are so big, because we take that cube root of the stuff, of the length, and with whatever constants are here, this translates to security of like 2 to the 56. So a security parameter has to be linear in the root of the length of the prime, or otherwise, in the other direction, we set the security parameter and we ask, what is the prime that you need for discrete logarithm to have this, say, security 2 to the 128, so that this algorithm is basically the estimates of its running time are bound by 2 to the 128 steps. And you need to take n proportional to the cube power of the security parameter. Where the constants come from estimates of this algorithm, right? So we run the GNF, general number field sieve, for smaller curves, for smaller primes, and we see asymptotically how it behaves. So we have some, not just asymptotically, in concrete terms, with, right, because these are concrete measures. So these come from estimation of this algorithm for much smaller values. And then we hypothesize that, you know, the curve is going to go in a certain way predicted by the algorithm behavior for smaller inputs. And that's why with these estimates. Now, if there were improvements to the algorithm, this would imply having to hike up the sizes of these moduli. And as we said last time, on elliptic curves, we don't know this general number field. So we don't have attacks that have this asymptotic behavior. Instead, and we'll show shortly, we have only generic attacks, although that's not true for some elliptic curves with certain parameters have basically are weak, and there exist trapdoors to discrete logarithm for those curves, but they're very special. And you know, the consensus for now is that it's easy to avoid them. Okay, so that's because the algorithms, discrete algorithms on elliptic curves, they work with much worse efficiency than this. In particular, there are exponential, not in the third root of the length, but in length itself. That's why you have a linear relation between sizes of elliptic curve parameters and security parameter. Okay, so that's where we were last time. Okay, so a couple of points about this, right? So first of all, a simple observation that this is completely insecure against active attackers. So even if you believe in a discrete in a Diffie-Hellman assumption, that the function is hard to compute given random g to the a and g to the b. This is irrelevant if you have an active attacker, because the active attacker is often referred to as a man in the middle. It's clear because here he is between Alice and Bob, and I guess it's a sexist term that he's a man, in the middle. But it's okay. So far, we will just use man in the middle. There is places for women in cryptography, Alice, and also Eve, which is for eavesdropper, which I thought, it's like Alice is good, Eve is bad. There's also Carol. I guess Carol is a female. I don't even know. Yeah, that rings a bell. All right. So Alice and man in the middle. What he will do is Alice sends G to the A, and man in the middle just follows Bob's protocol. He chooses a B prime, and he sends G to the B prime. So he's a party in the protocol. Of course, because he just follows the Bob's algorithm, so he's going to compute this value, right? Essentially, from Alice's point of view, there is no difference between man in the middle and Bob. So by that token, if man in the middle just follows Bob's algorithm, he's going to establish a key with Alice, just like Bob would. And likewise, man in the middle can follow Alice's algorithm and send messages instead of her to Bob, in which case the session key established by these two parties is going to be G to the A times B prime, where this B prime is the attacker's contribution, sort of when he's pretending to be Bob in front of Alice. And the key that he establishes with Bob is G to the A prime B, where A prime is the randomness in the Alice's code, which man in the middle executed when interacting with Bob, right? Because the code is public. Everybody knows what a Diffie-Hellman key exchange looks like. So everybody can pick little a, little b, little c, little a prime, right? And just run on those inputs. So if you think that because these two keys are different, so Alice and Bob somehow figure out that they were given different keys, well, it's not so easy, because whatever they do with these keys, man in the middle has the same key, so he can verify, decrypt anything that is encrypted or signed using this key. And he just turns around and does exactly the same thing under this key. So from Bob's point of view, we cannot tell whether this was created by Alice or man in the middle. Simply, the only security handle Bob has is this key. And unfortunately, that key is shared with the attacker and not Alice. And likewise, from Alice's point of view. Now, there are possibilities here. So like, let's say that Alice and Bob, these are bits, right? So maybe Alice can read off those bits over the telephone, and Bob, picks up the receiver and just listens to her voice. And if her voice says whatever bits this has, Bob will believe that Alice receives the same key. And then therefore, there must have not been any attacker. So we could do that kind of stuff, but it's not automatic. And if you think about the practicality of these things, they're pretty bad. This thing has, 4,000 bits. What happened when this thing has, let's say, 4,000 bits. It's huge. Even in elliptic curves, the minimum is 160 bits, and that's quite a handful to speak. You can encode it. So there are encodings which render any bit string into human readable string. Like, for example, pick words from the dictionary, and it's gonna be a nonsensical phrase, but at least it will be a phrase that one can read easily, right? If you know the language, and you can pronounce things, which not all of us can, including me. The Bob, on the other hand, on the other side, will see if you have the same words, right? And there's other encodings possible. People try to encode these things in all sorts of stuff. If you, for example, these are two cell phones, then well, one can encode a very high entropy string into so-called QR code, and the other can film it and compare to its local QR code, right? So it could be completely automatic if you film each other. There is other possibilities, like when maybe you don't film, maybe you just turn on the microphones, and one plays a melody, like an old fax machine, like the other listens to that and converts that to bits. So all of things are possible, but they require proximity, or they require some other out-of-band channels. So some what we call an authentic. So what really happened when Alice is read her key to Bob? The assumption was that there's an authenticated channel, a telephone, that it doesn't need to be private. Although actually, yes, if she reads the bits of this, then actually better be private, because if she broadcasts the bits of the key just to authenticate it, that's not a great solution either, right? Yes, we authenticated the key, but we also gave it up. Now we have no key to speak of because we broadcast it to the whole world. So we need to authenticate it without revealing it. Okay, perhaps we can, use the key to MAC, right? Like MAC something, unknowns. Perhaps this transcript. So authenticating this stuff is okay. So what exactly, how should you authenticate this? This is let's leave this as a question mark for now. But let me just point out that any kind of system where Alice is going to read off something, the key, the MAC of the key, the MAC of the transcript using the key to Bob, well, that assumes that there's an authenticated channel, and this authenticated channel perhaps can be created by a telephone and the fact that Bob knows Alice's voice. But that's also problematic because of the AI kind of fakes, right? Like, so with enough of recordings of Alice, I can create Alice speaking things, and Bob might not tell a difference, right? So, but that's it's a kind of cat and mouse game. We'll come back to authenticating of this later on. For now, just see that there's no hope of active attack security of such protocols. Okay. Okay. No hope without adding something, right? They cannot be active attack secure by themselves. Perhaps adding authenticated channel. Perhaps adding some other thing to the picture. Perhaps adding passwords. Okay, so there's different solutions for different right? Because for example, let's say you're pairing up a Bluetooth headphones with a cell phone. Well, hey, they are actually in proximity. So a solution might be very different because you are in proximity. Then key exchange facilitating key exchange across long distance, right? And are you facilitating it between humans who are going to converse in a phone conversation and therefore already are listening to each other's voices? Or are you doing it for some automatic entities that, or humans who are not sharing a phone connection? Okay. Let's look at what we can still do with the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. In spite of this insecurity against an active attacker. Okay, maybe the conclusion here should be that if there was some way for Alice to authenticate this message to Bob, so that when Bob gets a message, he can distinguish whether it came from Alice or it came from an attacker, because that's what this enables this attack. Precisely Bob's inability to distinguish a random group element chosen by Alice from a random group element chosen by an attacker. Indeed, they are distributed exactly the same way, right? But if there was some out-of-band means of authenticating these messages and proving that Bob somehow had a way to tell that this really came from Alice, then a man-in-the-middle attack would be thrown out, right? Because the only thing that the man-in-the attacker can do is to just pass this message to Bob, because an authentication means that nothing else will pass Bob verification on the Bob's side. Likewise, if Bob's messages were authenticated for Alice on Alice's side, then what he can do here is just to pass this along, or because nothing else will be will pass the authentication mechanism. In which case, man in the middle is a passive attacker. He just passed the A and passed the B, so he's nothing else but an eavesdropper. And by Diffie-Hellman assumption, we do believe that this, by Diffie-Hellman assumption, this protocol is secure. So let's imagine that there was an authentication of these Diffie-Hellman key messages, G to the A, G to the B. Then actually you have something much stronger than just a pairwise key exchange here. Because Alice, say if everyone picked their Diffie-Hellman outgoing message, so Alice picks a little randomness, little a, and she creates this Diffie-Hellman contribution, G to the A. So does Bob. So he picks this little b, and Charlie picks little c, and David picks little d, etc. And these, remember in the Diffie-Hellman key protocol, the exponents are trapdoors. If you reveal your little a to the world, then everybody will be able to complete the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So to finalize and compute the keys, Diffie-Hellman key, right? These exponents are trapdoors in this function. If you leak little a or you leak little b, then everybody can compute this result, right? Take capital A to the little b or take capital B to the little a. Either way, you get this. So these exponents are like private keys. They must be kept. Alice must keep her close to her heart and not reveal it. And Bob must do the same with the little exponent, little b. So let's say every party picks their little exponent and keeps it secret, private, but publicizes this Diffie-Hellman contribution. Now, not only Alice can create a key with Bob, she can create it with Charlie. she can create it with David. And all these people can create keys between one another. So this is actually, this allows once people send these Diffie-Hellman messages, they can complete any I with any J can complete this. So for example, for Alice and Charlie, the key they would share is G to the AC. But again, so that without authenticating these values, there is a man-in-the-middle attack, right? The same attack we had before. So let's say that we trust some authority, okay? And I chose Facebook here, which doesn't mean that I'm suggesting it really, right? But let's just say that there is some service that can be trusted to maintain authenticated data for people. So if that service says that G to the A is an Alice's contribution, then this is sacred. Like they cannot lie. Okay. And in particular, this means that if Charlie wants to talk to Alice, he just asks the Facebook service, okay, give me the key that is associated with Alice, or all this data is published in an authenticated data structure that is signed by the Facebook. So if somebody trusts Facebook, they can verify that this G to the A is associated with an ID, Alice, which is some universal identifier, which Charlie will recognize as Alice. There's a lot of ifs here, right? Universal namespace, unique strings. Somehow no one in the world will preempt Alice and register this contribution as hers, but really it's the attacker, right? So look at this attacker. What does he do? Alice wants to register G to the A, but the attacker instead registers the G to the A prime as Alice's Diffie-Hellman contribution, right? If he manages to do that, the same attack goes through. So somehow Facebook must authenticate these people, and when they send the contribution, it's Facebook's job to make sure that the contribution that Facebook now is going to sign as, that this is Alice's and this is Bob's and this is Charlie's, that this is preceded by these parties authenticating to Facebook and proving that they're really who they claim. So you didn't get out of the necessity of authentication, but you just split the job into two. You say, well, I don't need to know how to authenticate people. I just need to know how to authenticate what Facebook says. Okay. And then there is a second component, very important, that Facebook does need to authenticate all these people. So they still need some authentication mechanism, but the verifier is just one, Facebook, and Facebook works as this intermediary, which is going to verify these and swear by them that because Facebook verified them, and sign it and service this to and provide this view to everybody who asks, right? Of course, Facebook can do a denial of service attack, right? Erase this, and now nobody can establish a key with Alice. But even worse, in a sense, Facebook can replace this key by G to the A prime. So clearly, we trust Facebook very strongly here. In fact, they can replace anyone's key. So it's great. You created some intermediary, but in a sense, you made it worse. There is now this central authority. If you corrupt it, or if this authority becomes compromised, or if it's not trustworthy to begin with, this authority has an incredible power of basically breaking security of everyone by replacing these things with their own contributions, right? And therefore knowing the exponents. So when Charlie wants to talk to either Alice or Bob or David, he will just talk to whoever compromised Facebook or Facebook itself. So, okay. But let's go with the assumption that Facebook is, that we have this trusted authority that basically works as a authenticated bulletin board. Everybody can place their own information, but it's authenticated. So the bulletin board does not allow everybody to overwrite this. Whoever writes this, and it's going to be associated with Bob, bulletin board must be authenticating that source. An interesting technical question is, can you compute, if you want to have a communication in a group, so Alice doesn't want to just talk to Charlie. She wants to create a single key that Bob and Charlie and David could compute as well, and nobody else. That's the called group key agreement. And it's interesting that for using elliptic curves with some special properties that are called bilinear maps, you can solve it for 3 people very easily. Very easy. It's a elliptic curve with an extra procedure. It's called a bilinear map. And for larger keys, there are solutions that are not, they exist, but they're not, they are not as, well, I don't want to say feasible, because feasible means polynomial time, but they're just not practical as of now. Okay, let's look at that this is actually very close to a public key encryption, where we are already. So what is the public key encryption? Okay, it's a pair of algorithms, encrypt and decrypt, just like in symmetric ciphers. But the difference is that in a key generation, instead of picking one key from a key space, we generate 2 keys, secret and public. It's what's called a public key keeper. And the semantics of it is that the public key will be used by the encryption algorithm. So encryption computes the ciphertext on input the plain text as before, but for a key it takes a public key. Decryption uses the secret key, the private key. And the correctness is that if you encrypt whatever message under a public key, and then you take the resulting ciphertext, you decrypt it under the corresponding secret key, you must get the same message back if these 2 are generated correctly. But what about security? Okay, so key generation now, the spaces of public key and secret keys will no longer be, okay, or sometimes they will be, but in general, they will not be just pick a key from at random from some set. Rather, it might be a more complicated algorithm which will generate a secret key and together with a public key. Most of the time, you can split the job by generating the secret key and then a public key as its function. So given a secret key, public key can be computed, but not the other way around. But in case of RSAs, it's actually, well, you can look at RSAs this way, but it's not the most natural one. Encryption is going to be always randomized now. So given the public key and a message, a randomized encryption algorithm is going to output some cipher, to create a ciphertext. And decryption is basically deterministic almost always, except of some exotic cases. And it will output a message or it will reject, right? Because as we've seen in a symmetric cryptography case, if you don't reject, then you have no chance of, no. Oh, you know what? No, no. I wanted to say no chance of CCA security. Actually, this is not true. You might have a CCA secure encryption that never rejects. It's just that whatever ciphertext adversary forms, even if it gets decrypted, it's useless in attacking the challenge ciphertext. We have not seen such an encryption. Like all our CCA secure encryptions that we have seen in the last segment, basically were CCA because they could recognize badly formed ciphertext and reject it. And they made sure that if you don't have the key, then the only cipher that you can form is badly formed. Note that that was only possible in a symmetric key cryptography case. Now, in a public key cryptography, the encryption is supposed to work. Okay. So this is the consistency. So what is different here? I mean, maybe I just have renamed the public key and secret key. I can still make them equal, and therefore see all symmetric key crypto systems as cases of these two algorithms where public key and secret key are just the same. No, because the security requirement will be that it all has to be as secure as symmetric crypto systems, even if the public key is distributed, is broadcast. So when you generate a public secret public private key pair, you will broadcast the public key. So in particular, adversary gets to know public keys of everyone. Okay, so that's and that's indeed how we're going to use public key encryption, right? This is why this key is called public, because you're supposed to broadcast it, make it public. So now if you instantiate it with symmetric key crypto systems, they break immediately, because if public key and secret key are equal to the same symmetric key, then you just broadcasted it. And symmetric key crypto systems now have no guarantees in obvious way, right? Like attacker basically, if he has the keys and he has everything. So this also means that ways to guarantee CCA security will have to be somehow different, because in the symmetric key case, we said, okay, these were symmetric keys, and the encryptor used his key not only to encrypt, but also to authenticate. So with an attacker, and the decryptor would verify this authentication and reject if authentication didn't work out. And these were secure. The arguments always went by, if attacker has no key, then they cannot authenticate, and therefore the ciphertext that attacker forms will be rejected by the decryptor. So in a public key crypto system, you cannot do it that way, because if the only thing that the sender has is a public information, then how can he use it to authenticate anything? Attacker has the same information, and he will be able to authenticate in exactly the same way, right? So these ways of assuring CCA security are now hosed. Okay, and yet CCA security will be possible. Okay. So, but let's first say, okay, so we have the correctness. Now, what about indistinguishability or chosen plaintext attack security? Well, this indistinguishability is the same experiment as we have had before, right? So there is some secret bit, but except now, instead of in a symmetric key cryptography case, here you just chose a key from a key space. Now you run a randomized key generation algorithm and you generate a public-private key pair. And you announce the public key straight to the attacker. You announce it to the whole world, and therefore attacker gets it in particular. The rest is the same. Attacker chooses two messages in a message space, gets an encryption of either this or that based on this bit, and has to predict this bit. And we say it's secure if the skew of the probability with which, say this output is 1, given that this one is 0, versus this output is 1, while this one is 1 as well, that these two are negligibly close, and therefore, basically, the system hides the bit B. So what's new here? Basically, only this. Attacker knows the public key. Well, and also here, that the same public key is used in encryption. And this basically means that notion of indistinguishability is the same as chosen plaintext attack security for public key encryption. What was CPA security for symmetric crypto systems? There was no key here. The key was just kept by the challenger. But attacker had an ability to send any message to the challenger and see the ciphertext, right? This was called chosen plaintext attack. Attack chooses plaintext, gets to see the ciphertext. Here, if you added such an oracle to this picture, it would be useless, because an oracle that generates random encryptions of whatever plaintext attacker wants is not needed, since attacker has the public key and the encryption algorithm uses only public key as an input. Therefore, for whatever chosen plaintext A wants to see encrypted, he can run this locally, the public encryption algorithm on a public key, and compute these ciphertexts locally, right? That's why adding CPA encryption oracle is not needed, does not change this picture. But one more thing about it as a consequence. Well, if already here you captured chosen plaintext attack security, yes, because you did in a public key setting, the public key suffices for adversary to encrypt whatever he wants and see what the resulting ciphertexts are. He doesn't need an access to the sender who uses this plain public key to encrypt. That means that a notion that tries to, that if encryption satisfies this property, well, then it must satisfy this one, because these two properties are identical. And therefore, in a public key setting, there is no difference between one-time security and many-time security. If you remember, well, so that's a proof that we had on the homework about left or right versus CPA, the standard CPA notion. They were equivalent, but it was not so easy to argue. You argued it by the hybrid argument. And it is the same argument that shows that one-time security defined here actually extends to many-time security. Meaning, if you generalize this by saying that adversary chooses not just one message, but any number of such pairs, M0I, M1I, like in left or right security notion for symmetric encryption. And each time he chooses this pair, he gets a ciphertext I, which is an encryption of MBI, right? So one of these two encrypted. And the which one? It's always chosen by bit B. This would be an equivalent notion. You don't need to add this. And the proof of that is exactly the same as the proof that we had in the homework in that problem, and it's also in the textbook. But one thing that follows from that, where are we? Is that CPA security must be randomized to satisfy either one-time or many-time security because they are identical. And why? Precisely because they are identical. Remember the basic attack on deterministic encryption, which is if you want to have chosen plain text attack security, you cannot achieve it with deterministic encryption. Why? Well, if let's say I just want M0 to be encrypted, I get the ciphertext, and then I want M1 to be encrypted for the good measure, I get the ciphertext. And now my chosen pair of messages is M0, M1. And because the encryption is deterministic, so I will either get the first ciphertext or the second one. I will know exactly what was encrypted because I already hold ciphertext for both of these messages, and encryption is deterministic. In the case of public encryption, I don't need the first step. I can locally compute encryption of first message, locally compute encryption of second message, and if I get an encryption of one of my messages here, then I just locally compare to the two ciphertexts and decide this bit, whether MB is M0 or M1. So no hope for security for a deterministic public key encryption because the encryption key is public. So, well, public key encryption, of course, it's going to be great for all sorts of stuff, but in particular, it creates a key exchange. Very simply, Alice just picks her private key pair and sends a public key over. Bob encrypts a random key, X, under the received public key. Alice decrypts the received ciphertext under the corresponding secret key and gets the random key that Bob chose. This key X is a key for that both Alice and Bob output. Now, if you have a passive attacker, the only one for which we can hope to have security of this is equivalent to CPA security or indistinguishability, that's the same thing, of this public key encryption. Because what does the attacker see? He sees the public key and a ciphertext. And these are the two things he sees, right? And now look, if there was an attack on this, if there was an attack that somehow found information about X, then let's do the following thought process, which is a proof of security of this protocol, which is that, okay, adversary, what he sees is the public key and encryption of this key X. public key went from Alice to Bob. The ciphertext went from Bob to Alice. Let's create an imaginary view where we keep the public key, but we replace the ciphertext with an encryption of random garbage, or not random, but a fixed constant, okay, all zero string. If, however, attacker acted, so we will define what it means in a very soon, but basically any way it acted, like for example, if it could tell some bits of X, or could tell X from random, or it could output X, given these inputs, well, he can do the same here. Because if he cannot, then you have an attack on indistinguishability of encryption. The reduction picks an X, chooses as the challenge pair M0 equal to X, and M1 all zero string. So these are the two messages that this reduction sends to the encryption challenger. And he gets an encryption of one of them. If the challenger bit is 0, he will have this view. And then he just takes the ciphertext and passes it to this attacker that claims to perform some computation differently in given this view and given this view. So he performs that computation, and if this is measurable in any way, then the reduction does this measurement and outputs whatever the measurement says. If the encryption challenge bit was 0, reduction will create this view to the attacker. If the encryption bit was 1, and reduction creates this view to the attacker. So if the attacker acts differently on these, and a reduction it's publicly verifiable somehow, even given X verifiable, because here the reduction will pick X. Then you break indistinguishability of encryption. So therefore, by encryption security, you can replace this in your head, kind of in the security argument, right, with the hybrid view, a modified game, which is this. And here there is easy to see, there is no information about X. Therefore, this contains no information about the session key. Therefore, in this world, it is as if Alice sends PK to Bob, and Bob sends an encryption of an all 0-bit string. And then magically X appears on both Alice's and Bob's side. Clearly, you can throw this out because it had nothing to do with X. So, it could be completely insecure, or, maybe the encryption doesn't work. At this point in the argument, you don't really care what these things are, because the only thing about them you care about is that they don't have anything to do with X, which is just randomly chosen and magically appears on both sides. And therefore, it is a secure key exchange, because it's some process that created by magic a key on both sides, and whatever happened during this process is equivalent to garbage, because this is what really happened, and this is the garbage that is useless for getting any information about X. Okay, so this is basically a corollary of security of encryption, that this key exchange works. Well, and it's also just as insecure against an active attacker, right? An active attacker can just send whatever public key it wants on behalf of Alice to Bob, and then Bob will just encrypt his session key under PK prime. Since attacker has the corresponding SK prime, he will decrypt the ciphertext and get back this key X. And now the situation is even worse than in the Diffie-Hellman case, in a sense, because he can use the same session key and now encrypt it under Alice's key. Alice will take the ciphertext decrypted get X. And now even what's worse is that even if Alice and Bob could authenticate this key X, well, that wouldn't be helpful because they actually do have the same key X. The problem is that adversary also has the key, right? So it is measurably, what is the worst about this is that attacker can pick any X basically he wants. So any cryptographic system based on some assumptions that X is chosen from some correct distribution, well, it will not be when an attacker is present. The same thing is not so easy to make in a differential key exchange, where you have to send some little message. So does attacker have complete control over these two keys? Not really, because let's say that he wants this to be an all one string, okay, or like a string that a chosen string by him. Well, can he do it? Not quite. He would need to find a discrete logarithm between this and that. So if this is given as a challenge to attacker and say, well, create a Diffie-Hellman key message so that the key is this challenge. On random challenges, attacker cannot work unless discrete logarithm is easy. So this tells you that he has limit. Of course, he can choose different p primes and just compute it forward and see, okay, do I like this key? But if that's the only thing he can do, he can cover some subspace of group elements and choose from them. But that subspace might not have the really interesting keys. Okay, and if you take this value and then subsequently hash it, we'll see soon how, then you can force this key to be basically as good as random. But what you cannot prevent is adversary computing this key as well, right? Because no matter how this procedure determines the key, by say hashing this value, attacker can follow it. Okay, but it's just that he cannot hit any challenge that he for some reason desires. Okay, and whereas in this encryption scheme, sorry, in this key agreement, attacker can choose. So Bob, playing the Bob side, basically has complete control over the key. So how are we going to authenticate this? Well, this basically shows also that any scheme that attempts to achieve security here by authenticating just the final key is doomed, because authentication, if Alice had some authentication ways and she signed X, that's okay. Bob can verify the signature, and it still doesn't prevent this attack. What they have to authenticate is the transcript, because the transcript of this interaction, Alice had a public key, and Bob sent certain ciphertext, and the attack definitely requires attacker to replace the public key with some new one. So if this part of this of the transcript was authenticated to Bob, then this attack would be impossible. Okay, maybe you need a little less on this side, but you also need, if you have authentication, then you will have a security argument, just like for Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So that's actually a generic argument. If you have any ways of authenticating a transcript of key exchange, then you have a compiler from a key exchange that is secure against just eavesdropper to a key exchange that is secure against a man in the middle and an active attacker. Okay, so okay, so let's look at what this would do if you. So similarly with the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, Alice can pick her own secret public pair, and so would anyone. And if they published associations, sorry, if this Facebook in my previous slide, but here I call it authenticated registry of public keys. If it wrote down associations between public keys and identities, and it was trusted to do so, so if it verified the source of these public keys and really authenticated Alice as the person who sends this public key, Bob as the person who sends this public key, etc. Then anybody like Charlie who wants to talk to Alice would get this association from the public key registry and treat PKA as the real public key of Alice, and therefore encrypt messages for her, and in particular encrypt keys for her, and therefore establish a authenticated a key exchange, a secure key exchange. Well, actually, if he just sends her this resulting ciphertext, that's not good enough. But note that Alice and Charlie, if Charlie can grab Alice's public key and Alice can grab Charlie's public key, then they can encrypt. Charlie encrypts a little X to Alice, and Alice encrypts a little Y, let's say, to Charlie under Charlie's public key. And the key is some function of both X and Y. The function has to be such that the adversary must find both in order to compute that function. Okay, and if he does, then he will have to he can replace this ciphertext that are flowing later. It doesn't matter. Because he cannot replace he cannot decrypt the ciphertext that is sent by Charlie, and he cannot decrypt the ciphertext that is sent by Alice. And if the key involves the contribution X and Y by both of these, then he does need to decrypt both of them. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what do we have in practice here? Sorry. What do we have? So authenticated public key registry is basically gives rise to public key infrastructure. Okay. It is in a public key infrastructure, we have an entity called certificate authority. It's an entity that will pick a signature key. And for now, just think of signature as a public key version of a MAC. So just like a public key encryption has a private and public key, where private is used for decryption and public for encryption, signature will also have a private and public key. The public private will be used for signing, like in a macking, and the public for verifying the signatures. Okay, so certificate authority picks a signature key and broadcasts the public key to the whole world. Now, let's say that this broadcast is authenticated. So the public key of the certificate authority is embedded in every piece of software and cannot be changed, so that when you run it and you think that you're verifying signatures under using this public key, you truly are. Okay, of course, if you don't pay attention and somebody switch these keys for you, then you are not. But under the assumption that the system is not taken over by viruses and the data is not replaced, it will use the correct public key to verify. Okay, how is this CA's public key used? The certificate authority will use its secret key to, after it authenticated Alice as the source of this public key, it signs the association between Alice's name, unique identifier, and that public key. And it does so for everybody, right? So it will just create these signatures, and everybody must store this. And what it does with these signatures is that it returns this to Alice. So Alice gets this signature. This signature is called her certificate. The certificate is more than the signature. There's whatever text comes here, which is not only her name, but also all sorts of identifiers, all sorts of fields like expiration time. What kind of protocols is this certificate good for? What is the public key here? Is it an RSA or El-Gamal, or is it an elliptic curve, or what? All sorts of other stuff is signed here, but let's take the first approximation, and that's the most essential part, that you sign some unique identifier for this party. So, for example, in a web security case, this is DNS address of a server, right? So, www.ics.uci.edu. It's a unique address of information in computer science school at University of California, Irvine. And if anybody talks to a server under this domain, then they will use that DNS as the identifier for Alice, for this server. This server here, played by Alice, is going to be pick his secret private key, hand over the public key to some CA, gets a certificate, which is an association signature under association between the public key and the unique identifier for that server. So UCI, www.uci, ICS UCI edu. And anybody who talks to this entity, right, will do what? Well, everybody will hold this public key. When I want to talk to Alice, what does she do? She sends me the public key, her public key, and she sends me this certificate. And she also sends to me like what her identity is. Now, if I really wanted to talk to this identity, if that's the identity I truly wanted to communicate with securely, I will verify this association, this signature, under the public key of the CA. If it verifies, then I will conclude that the CA couldn't have signed it unless it verified that this public key really came from this entity. So that this public key was really given by UCI, whoever owns ICS UCI edu, to some certificate authority. And the other party, let's say Charlie, will do the same. So Charlie will do that with Alice, and Alice will do that with Charlie. So now they have authenticated key pair of public keys. They will be able to do a key exchange, right? Alice encrypts little x under PKC. Charlie encrypts little y under PKA. And you can start it up that way. So I'm claiming that this picture that we have of a Diffie-Hellman key agreement is already there. So what this view of Diffie-Hellman is already basically viewing it as a public key encryption. the reason that Charlie was able to create the key with Alice is because he had effectively what is a public key. So a Diffie-Hellman message can be treated as a public key and can implement a public key. And the Diffie-Hellman little exponent can implement a private key, corresponding private key in an encryption scheme. And G to the C is Charlie's public key, and little c is Charlie's private key. And Diffie-Hellman already yields this. Let's see exactly how this is done. Okay. So let's look at Diffie-Hellman and argue that basically it creates a public key encryption. So that's the view of the Diffie-Hellman again. And here is, so, okay, Alice sent her contribution. I'm going to call this a public key. Bob sent this contribution. I'm going to now rename it as part of Bob's ciphertext. Alice's computation, I'm going to rename it as decryption. Bob's computation, I'm going to rename it as encryption. And if you do that, then okay, this is the public key. What Bob did was he sends this capital B, the G to the little b contribution to Diffie-Hellman. But now in order to really convert it to an encryption, I'm going to, okay, he finalizes the Diffie-Hellman on his side, right? Which means that he computes this Diffie-Hellman key value by taking Alice's contribution and exponentiating it to his exponent. So far, this is just an output of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Now, this is a group element. So if Bob has a message that he wanted to encrypt, I don't know how to use the symmetric key crypto systems that I had built so far, because these symmetric key crypto systems assume that the key is a random bit string, so of sufficient size. Whereas here, what I have is a group element, which in the case of the Diffie-Hellman instantiated the way I showed a bunch of slides now, right? With the same picture, that is a modular residue. So it's a random element mod P. Even that is not, okay, so I can convert an integer into a bit string, but this is a random 128 bit string? Not exactly. And if it's over an elliptic curve, then it's even less a bit string by itself, right? It's elliptic curve elements are pairs of integers which satisfy some arithmetic a cubic relation. X square is so y square equals x to the cube plus, or ax to the cube plus bx plus c. And there's parameter abc, and all of this is modulo some prime, right? So an elliptic curve, this is the pair of residues that satisfy some property. Even less of a bit string. But here is a simple thing. I can use a certain form of hash. It can be a universal hash, like used in Carter-Wegman. In fact, that suffices. But it can be also something stronger, which will model as a random oracle hash. For all reasons, and you can plug any. What happens with my pointer? Okay, here you can put any collision resistant hash here on which outputs messages of the length that is needed for your encryption. So, but that's the case because collision resistant hash has at least 160 bit of output, and all encryption schemes of interest, they can take 160 bit key. Okay, like IES only needs 128. So we can patch this if needed for some. Again, what happened with my pointer? Okay, if needed for some other, if you need more keys, but more bits in the symmetric key. So that's what Bob does. This translates a random group element into a random bit string, and now you can take this bit string and use it as a key to encrypt. And so what you put in here is the hold on. What you put in here is the ciphertext of the symmetric encryption of M under K. Bob, when now it stopped working. Okay, Bob gets the stuff and decrypts it. How? He takes he interprets the first part of the ciphertext as a Diffie-Hellman contribution by Bob, completes the Diffie-Hellman key exchange on his side using little a, and then he has the same value to the AB. He hashes it to receive the key, and then now he has the symmetric key. So whatever this size, the symmetric ciphertext, he decrypts. So the circled parts are the Diffie-Hellman parts, now basically recast as an encryption. Okay. Now, to argue that this is a secure encryption based on just a Diffie-Hellman key assumption, you have that argument in the textbook. It is an argument, it is so-called hybrid encryption argument, because it is in two steps. First of all, forget about this encrypting message M using symmetric key cryptography. Let's think of this as a delivery mechanism for a random key. So it's an encryption that it's called KEM, key encapsulation mechanism, that creates. Bob does not choose key K freely, but he computes some little key K, and so does Alice. The security of this mechanism is, so the syntax is that they cannot encrypt a random message, any message they want. They just both create a little K, both the sender, Bob, and the receiver, Alice. The security is that this key K is hidden to the attacker. So an attacker, even if he received key K or a random string, he couldn't tell a difference. He couldn't tell, is he getting a random key K or is he getting a random string? He cannot tell. That's one mechanism, and its security essentially follows from security of key exchange. There is one more step here for this universal hash, but it's an easy one. Okay, let's say. What happens later is that this, but that was only, so what that gave is ability to create a short message, a short secret message on both sides. You can use it to encrypt a short message. Let's say if you, instead of just sending key K, you use it to XOR a message. And in a second step, you say, okay, any mechanism that allowed Alice and Bob to create a short key is enough to encrypt long messages, because I just use any secure symmetric encryption scheme using this key as an input to encrypt arbitrary long strings now. That's called hybrid encryption construction. So you use public key stuff only to encrypt short strings, K in this case, and then you use this string K to encrypt arbitrarily long using symmetric key crypto system, which are cheap, right? Like you just spent block cipher per block size of plain text. You don't, but the number of public key operations is independent of the length of the message. That paradigm is also described in the book, and also argued that it's a secure, there's a secure way to go about it. So you can separate the concern of public key cryptography and limit them to just encrypting short strings. Because using symmetric key cryptography, you can now take it up and encrypt arbitrary long messages. Okay, so as usual in crypto, we try to isolate what's the minimal thing you need to do so that later you can hook up stuff you already know to extend it, right? Because in practice, we don't want to just encrypt short strings. Let's say if this is SHA, then SHA-256, then this is a 256-bit string. Okay, that's not enough. What I want to, encrypt, it's an email or an IP message, right? IP packet. But I can, using symmetric key mechanisms, with the short string as a symmetric key. Okay, so we'll come back to exactly how this is structured in practice, and I guess I'm before, but anyway, this is a slide. I want you to think through. These are just the last two slides. So just look at them on your own to understand what is the correct notion of a key exchange security. In particular, is the notion that would allow this key for this hybrid encryption argument to go through. So whatever the aim of security was between the key agreement part of this, which is from here to this key, it must be strong enough that I can argue security of this separately, and then when I instantiate it using this construction, and then plug any symmetric key encryption here, I get security. That's what the last two slides talk about. Okay, and I will end here and open for I mean, you can ask any time, but in particular now. And so this is like a conceptual stuff, right? Like it's sort of, you have a general picture of where we're going, what is the security notions, right? But in the meantime, you have to read about modular arithmetics and why these modular arithmetic computations work, and because we'll assume that. So I'm not explicitly going over this. I'm just kind of saying, okay, there's a group structure and you can exponentiate and you generate all elements. But I'm giving you guidelines on like which parts to read to understand this modular arithmetics better.